So if I were to ask you to be thinking back to your high school or middle school or years, a favorite class that comes to mind. Does anybody have one that sort of just immediately jumps to mind? They're like, my favorite class in school was this. Shout it out. Choir. I knew somebody would say gym class. Algebra. Wow. All right. You and I are very different. Any others? Science, history. All right. Yeah, lots of different people. When I think back to my years in high school, a class that I really enjoyed in high school was my chemistry class. It was the science class that I did the best in during my high school career. And in chemistry, if you took chemistry in high school, you think back to chemistry, you remember if your chemistry class was all like mine, you did a lot of like hands-on types of things. We did labs, we did experiments, we did things that sort of got us up from the desk and taking notes and got us actively involved and doing things. Now, if you ask me how much do I remember from my high school chemistry class, not a lot. And that's reiterated quite a bit, being married to a high school chemistry teacher, and occasionally I'll see things she's preparing and I'm like, that's high school chemistry? Like, I do not remember that. And occasionally, I'll see these things and I'm like, man, that does not ring a bell. But there are a few things that stick in my brain, and I don't know if you're like me, like feel like it just seems totally random, the things that stick in my brain of things that I learned in high school. And one of the things that weirdly stuck in my head from high school chemistry class was the difference between a suspension and a solution. I don't know if this is ringing a bell for anybody else here. Great. There's also a third category called a colloid, which I did not remember existed. So for the purposes of what I'm talking about this morning, I'm going to pretend that doesn't exist. And we're going to have a little bit of a science-ish demonstration this morning to demonstrate the difference between suspensions and solutions. Okay? So a solution first. So a solution is a mixture. So if I take my little bottle, and I've tried this at home a couple times, and I've always made a mess. So we'll see how this goes this morning. But a solution is a mixture of two or more particles, and the particles within the solution can't be seen, and they sort of dissolve into the solution, and you can't easily separate the particles out. So so this is my little bottle of water here, and if I take something like sugar, which I've got here in my little Tupperware container, and open my bottle of water, use my funnel so I hopefully don't make too much of a mess, and I pour the sugar into the water. And if I shake it up, you can kind of see it gets a little bit cloudy, but you can still kind of see through. As the sugar kind of dissolves, you can see through the water, and you can start to see less and less of the sugar. Now the sugar is going to dissolve, and I can't get that sugar out of there now without some sort of like evaporating the water or something like that to like actually separate the sugar. I can't just dump this through a filter or something like that to get the sugar out. If you look at this, you can't even tell that the sugar is there. If you tasted it, you could probably tell that the sugar was there, but otherwise it's basically invisible, and it completely dissolves. Now, a suspension is something different. It's a mixture of two or more things now if I take flour, it's a mixture of two or more things where what you mix into the fluid does not dissolve and remains completely separate. So this is where I make the mess, because the flour is much harder to pour than the sugar. And we get it all in there. There we go. And you'll see the flour is not nearly mixing in as well. If I actively mix it though, what the flour will do is it'll start evenly disperse in the water, and it'll get mixed in there, but it does not dissolve. You could very easily see that the flour completely, you can't see through the water anymore. It completely kind of dominates the water. And as long as you keep actively mixing a suspension, it's going to stay distributed in there like that, but you're always going to be able to see the particles. You're always going to be able to, it kind of dominates the water. Like, you can't really see through it anymore. Now, but if I were to leave it and unmixed and not actively mix it, eventually what it does is it looks like this, and it's a little bit hard to see from far away, but the flour actually completely separates out and becomes something completely separate from the water. So you've got the water portion of our suspension here, and everything else all the flour sort of settles to the bottom. So, I know what you're thinking right now. This is riveting stuff, Eric. I'm on the edge of my seat. What are you going to do next? What does this have to do with anything? Well, I'll tell you. The reason this little experiment came to my mind this week is because I think this idea of solutions and suspensions are really good pictures of some of the different ways that we as people who follow Jesus tend to try to engage with and interact with our culture and the world around us, or maybe even try to not engage with our world and the culture around us. Whether it's issues of politics or sexuality or health or ethics or birth and death, entertainment, morality, the question of how do we live as followers of Jesus in a world with widely varying and often opposing views in all of those and many more areas is a pretty difficult one to answer, and we often land in different places. Do we fade into the background and really not try to call a lot of attention to ourselves and just sort of try to be invisible in the culture? Or do we fight to overtake culture and battle to make the culture more like us? Or do we disconnect from culture and separate ourselves out as something completely different and try to keep culture over there and our Christian community over here and not have the two things intersect at all? Or perhaps is there another way? It's a question that we do need to be prepared to address, and as believers, the hope would be that we would want to address it from a biblical perspective. The most recent issue of Christianity Today brought this issue to light around the area of politics. If you could take a look at this picture, is on the cover of Christianity Today, they've got an elephant and donkey sort of raging through a church, and people are running and scattering everywhere. And the image here is sort of getting at this idea. It shows the effects that politics seem to be having on churches, and that churches are being divided internally by politics. And people, in selecting a church and going to a church or deciding to stay or go to church, politics is becoming more of a deciding factor than elements of faith or doctrine. And people are leaving churches to be with churches that more closely match their politics, as opposed to churches that more closely match their doctrine and focus on doctrinal differences. And in response to this, we do see some Christians charging into the political fray in a way that's more faithful to their political party than it is to their Christian faith. And Christians oftentimes are being shaped more by things like political pundits or podcasts than the scriptures. Other people are just so fed up with politics that they just want to disengage and just seek to live a Christian faith. I just want to live my Christian faith privately. I don't want to engage in the public at all. Just let me kind of be me, do my own thing. I don't want to read the news. I don't want to engage in anything. And it brings us back to the question of how are we as Christians to conduct ourselves in the midst of such strongly opposing cultural tensions? And that's the question that we would like to be exploring in this series that we are starting today. And we're in the first week of a 10-week series that we're calling Faithful Presence. And we're going to be walking through the book of Daniel to learn how to be present in the world while remaining faithful followers of Jesus. As various political and social and moral and cultural agendas are raging around us, we wanted to have a series that focused us in on biblical wisdom for being present in the world, but yet remaining faithful to Jesus. But before we jump into this series and jump into the first message of the series, and we're going to explore Daniel chapter 1, I want to provide a little bit of background and a little bit of context of the book that we're going to be spending the next 10 weeks in. Daniel's 12 chapters long, and we're going to be spending a little time in each of those 12 chapters, but we're not going to be going necessarily verse by verse through all of the chapters. Daniel consists of two kind of different types of writing, if you've read the book of Daniel. It contains both what we call historical narrative, and we see that in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and then it also has what we call apocalyptic literature, which are the focus of chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel. In the historical narrative portion, that covers the time that Daniel and his friends are in captivity in Babylon and they're serving within the Babylonian government, while the apocalyptic literature portion deals with prophecy and imagery, and it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to understand. To define apocalyptic literature, it could be defined this way, the way the NIV Study Bible defines it, as symbolic, visionary, prophetic literature, usually composed during oppressive conditions, being chiefly eschatological and theological content. Apocalyptic literature is primarily literature of encouragement to the people of God. So that's kind of like how the book is broken up. And to get a sense of like the location of the book and kind of how that location relates to where we find ourselves here and now, I just want to summarize the first 7 verses of chapter 1 before we get into the verses that we're going to dive into. In the first 7 verses of Daniel chapter 1, we get a sense of the location of the book, and I think we also begin to get a sense of how it connects to where we live today. So around 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon lays siege to Jerusalem and conquers it, and carries off people and treasure back to Babylon. And after doing this, the king orders one of his chief servants to look among the people that they've brought back to Babylon in captivity. And he wants to find the cream of the crop of the people that he's brought back to Babylon in captivity. He's looking at Jerusalem's royal families and their nobility. He wants them to find the most good-looking and the most intelligent members of the people that they've brought back into exile. And he wants them to be fed, he wants them to be clothed, and he wants them to be trained to especially serve in the king's palace. And among these people that they find and out of this group of exiles, is Daniel, who ends up being renamed Belteshazzar, Hananiah, who is renamed Shadrach, Mishael, who is renamed Meshach, and Azariah, who gets renamed Abednego. So the king's servant plucks them and the others out. They're assigned daily provisions of food, and they're to be taught and trained in the language and the culture and the politics of the Babylonians so that they can serve in the king's palace. So we have the story of 4 of God's people who are forced to live and work among people that do not share their faith, their beliefs, or their values. So I think we can see some of the ways that the book of Daniel and Daniel's story parallels much of our existence in our day-to-day lives. No, our city was not besieged and we weren't dragged off to another land, but as followers of Jesus, we are people who live in a world full of people who do not share our faith, our beliefs, and our values. In light of this, the book of Daniel communicates to us a couple of big picture messages that we hope are going to come across throughout this series. In the prophetic elements of the book of Daniel, we see that in a time of uncertainty, God is with you, and God is the one who holds the future. In the midst of so much uncertainty, right, in our politics, in our culture, and maybe even we're feeling a level of uncertainty in our own personal lives as well. Where does our hope lie? Our hope doesn't need to lie in the outcomes of an election or economic trends or our own skills and knowledge as a parent, an employee, or a student, or a friend, whatever. Our hope is in the reality of God and his power and his wisdom. And in the narrative portions of Daniel, what we see is those in exile are to seek the good of the place they live as exiles. We see this message reiterated to the people of Israel in exile in the words of the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 29. At this time, when the Jewish people were first brought into exile, there were false prophets that were proclaiming to the people of Israel, like they were saying, "Don't worry, your time is going to be short. We're not going to be here very long. God is going to bring us back to our nation. Don't worry about it. This is all going to be over soon." So they weren't doing much. They weren't doing much to prepare. They weren't doing much to invest in the possibility of a long-term stay in Babylon. So through Jeremiah, God says these words, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord." Saying, settle in, settle down. You're going to be here for a while. And while you're here, work for the good of this community where I have placed you, because as it thrives, you will thrive. We too, as followers of Jesus, are also living in exile as strangers in a land that is really not our home. And we see Peter indicate that at the beginning of his letter in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. This is just how he opens his letter. He says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those chosen, living as exiles, dispersed abroad in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." We are living as exiles, as followers of Jesus in this world. And we too are to seek the good of the neighborhoods and the cities and the towns and the regions and the nation in which we are called by God to live. God's calling the people of Israel to plan to be a faithful, long-term presence in the place where he has them as exiles. And this faithful presence is the same thing that God has called us as followers of Jesus living as exiles in the world today. And this faithful presence is going to be the focus of the next 10 weeks that we're going to be spending in Daniel. And today, in week 1, we're going to begin to flush out this idea of faithful presence as we look at Daniel chapter 1 and focus on the big idea that faithful presence requires engaging the world without being defined by it. And as we look at Daniel chapter 1, we see Daniel do this in 2 primary ways, as Daniel seeks to stay true and faithful in his commitment to follow and obey God, while also seeking to stay engaged in relationship, service, and community in the world around him. And these are going to be the 2 practices that we're going to be focusing on as we flush out this big idea this morning. And the first one is that faithful presence requires that we stay true. We're going to have a look at the first verses 8 through 16 of Daniel chapter 1. Now remember, as we get into these next verses, Daniel is among people who've been carried off to Babylon in exile. He's among people that have been selected out of those exilees to be trained for special service in the palace of the king. They're given special food, special clothes, special education. So let's read these verses. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces, looking thinner than the other men your age? You would endanger my life with the king." So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned, to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see." He agreed with them about this, tested them for 10 days, and at the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So Daniel and his friends are faced with their first difficult decision, living in this new reality as exiles, and they're being presented with a lot of change, a lot of new things are being demanded of them, and they have to figure it out. What does it look like to live as a faithful child of God in this new setting, in exile? And there's a few things they seem to be okay with, a few things they seem to accept. There's no indication that they're protesting the new names that they're given, or the new clothes, or the education that they're being given, but they protest the issue of the food and the wine that's being supplied to them. It isn't immediately clear the reason the food and wine was an issue for Daniel and his friends. It could be that the food didn't align with Jewish dietary laws that they were expected to keep, or it could be something like the provision of this food carried with it maybe a perception of more alignment and allegiance to the king than they were comfortable with. But the reason isn't what's really most important here, but what's most important is that Daniel and his friends saw partaking in this food as a departure from their commitment to the one true God. So they approach the guard and seek to make other arrangements. Notice something about the way that Daniel handles his commitment to stay true in this scenario. He doesn't go to the king's servant and make demands. He doesn't try to orchestrate some sort of hunger strike or some sort of revolt. The passage says he asked permission. He went to the chief eunuch and asked permission. I think oftentimes when we're faced with situations when the demands of our world and our culture conflict with the beliefs, the habits, and the practices of our faith, we think we're left with only two options in those scenarios. Either I have to just kind of go along with it and sacrifice the faith element of my life that's in conflict here, or I have to start a really uncomfortable and aggressive conflict with somebody. I have to start an argument. And it really doesn't have to be this way oftentimes. Sometimes things can be resolved when we just ask. We just ask. You know, my kids are older now. Anna in her first year of college and Owen in his senior year. But throughout their lives, we've often encountered, and if you're a parent, I'm sure you've run into this as well, you've encountered demands in their schedules where something has conflicted with some other important activity or habit or program or community time related to their faith as followers of Jesus. And what we have found more often than not, when those conflicts come up, often when we have simply asked, hey, we've got this church thing going on this day. Is it all right if they miss this particular practice, or they're late, or they leave early? Is it a problem if once a week they're coming late or leaving early, or they miss this once a week? Most of the time, when we have approached the person in charge of that thing and asked, it hasn't been a problem. And now that hasn't always worked out that way. We haven't always gotten the response that that it's been fine. But a lot of the times, people have been willing to work with us and be okay with it. Oftentimes, we don't have to make demands or have really harsh protests. We can simply stay true by asking. Now, does that mean that there aren't times and situations where we need to draw harder lines and make more significant protests? Sure. And we see that a little bit later in the book of Daniel, and we sang about one this morning with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we see it with Daniel in the lion's den. Those events are coming in this series. And sometimes, yes, we do have to make and take harder stands. But maybe we start small in our commitment to stay true. When there's friction between faith and culture, we start by asking. Demands at work, getting in the way of our commitment to follow Jesus by caring for our family, maybe ask if changes can be made. If you have friends that are consistently wanting you to be involved in things that you know God would not want us involved in, maybe express your discomfort and ask, hey, maybe can we do other things when we're together? And I'm not overly comfortable with these things. Now, you might hear this and say, yeah, I don't really see that working. You don't know my boss, or you don't know the demands of my house, or you don't know my coach, or you don't know my teacher, or you don't know my friends. And you're right, I don't. but I do know God, and I know that he isn't, whatever situations or conflicts you're finding yourself in, I know that he isn't leaving you alone in those situations. Just like he didn't leave Daniel alone. And we know, as that we'll read later, is that for Daniel, time in prayer with God was a regular habit of Daniel's. And I'm sure that Daniel had spent some time in prayer prior to approaching the king's servant with this question. And God was at work in the heart of the king's servant before Daniel even comes to him with this question. As we read these words in verse 9, God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Bring cultural conflicts to God in prayer. God desires to work and is likely already at work in the situation right now, and perhaps preparing someone to have a very surprising response to you when you ask. Is that a guarantee that we'll get the response that we want? No, absolutely not. But it's a place to start in our desire to stay true in the midst of conflicting cultural demands. And I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of this series for more as we continue to talk about that. But secondly, in Daniel 1, we see that faithful presence requires staying engaged. Let's have a look at verses 17 through 21 of chapter 1. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So these 4 men begin serving the same man who led armies into their homeland, destroyed it, likely killed friends and members of their family, and then carried them off to a strange land as captives. We're in the midst of another tense presidential campaign with strongly held opinions about both of the major candidates that we have in this campaign. Imagine the candidate you support loses, and their opponent comes to you and asks you to work on their staff. They want you as an advisor to help them have the most successful presidency possible. What do you say to that? Don't answer out loud. I mean, Daniel's situation is incredibly more difficult. He's asked to serve the man that literally destroyed his nation. I wonder what the other Jewish exiles thought of Daniel and his friends filling this role. Some may have viewed him as a traitor to his people. Perhaps others viewed them as, hey, we've got an in with the king now. Maybe we can take him down from the inside. But as we'll see throughout the book, Daniel saw this as an opportunity to fulfill the call that Jeremiah would one day communicate to the people of Israel, that to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you in exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Something that you'll often see in the aftermath of an election, and even sometimes for years afterwards, are bumper stickers like this. A bumper sticker that says, "Not my president," right? And when Trump was president, these stickers were out there with pictures of Trump right on them. And now you'll see them out there with pictures of Biden on them. Whoever wins the next election, there'll be new bumper stickers with pictures of them on there. And probably the funniest thing about these stickers is that they're often sold by the same company. You know, the same company that you buy your Trump stickers from, you also buy your Biden stickers from. And they make money whoever wins. But it's kind of a way of saying, you know what, I'm not involved in this. I'm not responsible for what's currently going on in the governing forces of my country. And you know, to a certain extent, I get it. When we show a sticker like this, we're saying, if things went the way I wanted them to go, they would be different. I didn't choose this. And I get that. But what we don't have as followers of Jesus is the luxury of completely washing our hands of any responsibility to engage in culture in a way that seeks its flourishing, because an election didn't go the way I wanted it to. Daniel and his friends look at themselves and say, we've been put in a position to have influence for the good of this nation and by extension, the good of God's people. We're called to be engaged and use our gifts and our influence for that purpose. Staying true in faithfully following and obeying Jesus. This is what we're talking about in this series as we're talking about faithful presence. There are, however, though, several ways that we can run the risk of missing the mark of the faithful presence that we're called to. This phrase, faithful presence, is one that we've borrowed from a book by James Davis and Hunter called To Change the World. And in it, he outlines 3 different approaches that Christians have taken to cultural engagement other than faithful presence. The first 2 he outlines are ways that we as Christians tend to try to engage culture in what he would call, and what I think we would call, unhealthy ways. The first is the idea that we have to be defensive against the culture. Many Christian conservatives are often worried about the country becoming less and less Christian and less religious and want to protect it from non-Christian ideas permeating the culture. And these Christians often believe that we're in some sort of culture war. And this approach can be summarized as what we might call faithfully combative. Kind of like the mixed suspension. They're both kind of separated right now, but kind of like the mixed suspension that we had here, where we're looking to dominate the culture, make it a Christian culture. We see culture as something to be conquered, something to be dominated. Another is what we might call relevance to the culture. Many Christian progressives often focus on connecting with a culture in a way that either takes traditional Christian beliefs for granted, like, oh yeah, I'm sure everybody believes this, or downplays their importance. It doesn't matter what you believe. It's really more important that you're just nice and kind and you treat everybody fairly. It prioritizes right living over right believing. And in that, what we do is we sever the crucial connection between the life that the believer is called to and the person and power of God that we are called to know and trust. This approach could be called unfaithful presence. Like the solution, where the particles are too small to even see in the liquid around them. Are they even there? Engaging culture can't take the form of conformity to the culture or domination over the culture. If we are, as Jesus says, people who are to live in the world but not of the world, as we hear him say in John chapter 17 in verse 11, he says, I am no longer in the world, but they, his followers, us, are in the world. And then later on in verse 14, he says, they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. We are in this world, but this world is not our home. So you know what that makes us? Essentially house guests. What does it look like to be a good house guest? A good house guest seeks to find ways to be helpful, shows respect, acts in an upright manner, because as more than anything else, if you remember when you were a kid and you were sleeping over a friend's house, like what your parents were concerned about is how did you reflect on them, right? As a parent and as a kid in somebody else's house. What we are called to do is represent our Father well. In engaging the culture in our world, our ultimate desire is that some might desire to know our Father. The last approach mentioned by Hunter is more of a strategy of disengagement when he talks about purity from the culture. Some believers tend to withdraw into their own communities, engaging less and less with the outside world. They believe being faithful to Christ means creating church as a separate society and counterculture apart from the rest of the world. And this approach could be called faithful absence, like our unmixed suspension here, where it just separates out and becomes its own thing, doesn't engage or mix in at all. We can't be a faithful presence in the world if we sacrifice either one of these elements: commitment to the truth of God and commitment to engagement in our broader world. Being a faithful presence requires that we live in the natural tension that exists between our call to stay true and our call to stay engaged. And as we move through this series and we talk about these things and we move through the book of Daniel, it can be easy for us to be thinking what we're saying is we just want us to be more like Daniel. Go out there and be a Daniel in the world. That's a phrase that you'll sometimes hear as people go through the book of Daniel. But in reality, that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying here as we move through the series is the same thing that we've been coming back to over and over again in our Master Gardener series. Being a faithful presence in the world is becoming more like Jesus. Because as a faithful presence in our world, we reflect the reality that we serve a faithfully present Savior. Jesus took on human form. He came into this world. He engaged with sinful humanity while remaining faithful to the truth of the Scriptures. And in this, he sought our best as he laid down his life for us to restore us to right relationship with the Father. And now he remains faithfully present at the right hand of the Father, advocating for us as the reminder of the redemption that he purchased for us. Jesus didn't disengage from us. And he didn't come and conform to the practices and culture of humanity. And he didn't come and conquer and dominate. He came and gave himself and then presented us with an invitation to the real life that we are designed for, the life that we are called to live in him. And Jesus desires for us now to be his faithful presence in the world, seeking its peace and prosperity, and to be used by him to call others to himself. As we read his own words, and we'll close with these words in Matthew chapter 5. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Would you pray with me? Father, it is